What if I told you that while Florida's leaders were boasting about a record breaking economy, a silent collapse was already underway, threatening to wipe out an entire way of life? And what if the cause of this looming disaster wasn't a hurricane or a recession, but a few careless words spoken by powerful people? A strange and deeply troubling paradox is unfolding under the relentless Florida Sunday. On one hand, state officials, led by Governor Ron DeSantis, stand before cameras and confidently announce record breaking tourism numbers, painting a picture of a booming economy flush with visitors. They point to figures suggesting that in the second quarter of the year, a staggering 34.4 million people poured into the state, a testament, they claim, to Florida's enduring appeal. Yet, this official narrative crumbles upon contact with reality. Step away from the carefully managed press conferences and walk through the places where tourism is not a statistic, but a livelihood, and a completely different, far more desolate picture emerges. A simultaneous crisis is gripping the state. Its tourism industry, the very lifeblood of countless communities, is collapsing in real time, while its housing market is inundated with an unprecedented surplus of over 180,000 homes for sale, the largest number in its history. This is the central contradiction at the heart of Florida's current economic turmoil. A state officially celebrating success while its small business owners and workers are quietly drowning. The evidence of this on the ground reality is undeniable and profoundly unsettling. In what should be the absolute busiest time of year, iconic tourist hotspots are eerily quiet. The famous boardwalk at John's Pass in Tampa Bay, a place typically teeming with families, couples, and the cheerful chaos of vacationers, now sits mostly empty. The vibrant energy has been replaced by a somber stillness. Shop owners, who in years past might have half jokingly complained about being overwhelmed with customers, now sit behind vacant counters, the silence broken only by the glow of their phones as they scroll, anxiously wondering if tomorrow will bring anyone back. In restaurants that expected to be turning tables all night, servers are sent home early, their anticipated tips vanishing into thin air because there is simply nobody to serve. Hotel managers, their faces etched with worry, stare at reservation books filled with vast, intimidating blank spaces. They perform grim mental calculations, trying to figure out how long they can continue paying their staff before the entire enterprise falls apart. These are not isolated incidents or a few bad weeks. This is a sustained and deepening crisis. Across the state, business owners are reporting revenue drops of as much as 30% compared to the previous year, a catastrophic decline for operations that often run on thin margins. Many are calling this the slowest, most financially devastating season they have endured since the dark days of 2020, when the entire world came to a standstill. The hospitality sector, the engine of Florida's economy, has shed over 35,000 jobs, a number that represents tens of thousands of families suddenly thrust into financial precarity. While politicians celebrate abstract figures, the tangible world of commerce and community is contracting. This disconnect between official proclamation and lived experience reveals a terrifying truth. Florida's tourism collapse was not an unavoidable act of nature or an unpredictable market fluctuation. It was an entirely preventable crisis, a self inflicted wound born from a single toxic word. So the question is, how did this happen? How did an entire state's economic engine grind to a halt? The genesis of Florida's tourism freefall can be traced back to a specific moment in March of 2025 when a political firestorm erupted and its shockwaves radiated across the globe, directly impacting the travel plans of millions. The Atlantic magazine published a series of leaked private messages from the Signal app revealing candid conversations among high ranking officials in the Trump administration. While the primary topic was military strategy in Yemen, a series of comments buried within the exchanges would prove to be economically catastrophic. In a discussion about foreign policy, Vice President J.D. Vance expressed a clear reluctance to aid European nations. In response, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth shared his own disdain, remarking on his hatred for Europe's soft attitude. It was in this context that both men referred to America's oldest allies with a single deeply insulting term: parasites. What might have remained a contained, albeit ugly, private exchange exploded into an international incident when the President of the United States publicly endorsed the sentiment. When questioned by reporters, President Trump did not distance himself from his cabinet's language. Instead, he doubled down. He affirmed the statement, declaring unequivocally that Europeans had been parasites for years. That one word, now carrying the full weight of the American presidency, detonated across international news networks. In capitals from London to Rome, from Berlin to Madrid, people woke up to headlines broadcasting the American leadership's open contempt for them. These were not just political disagreements. This was a fundamental expression of disrespect from the highest levels of the U.S. government toward nations that had stood shoulder to shoulder with America through wars, built intricate trade partnerships over decades, and shared deep cultural and historical bonds. The insult was so profound that Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni was forced into the deeply awkward position of defending President Trump at a press conference, a moment of visible discomfort that was televised worldwide, cementing the narrative of a hostile and arrogant America. The fallout was immediate and tangible, translating from political outrage into canceled vacations and lost revenue. For prospective tourists, rhetoric matters. The idea of spending thousands of dollars to visit a country where the government leaders openly view you and your people as freeloaders is, to put it mildly, unappealing. The story of Mallory Henderson, a marketing consultant from London, became emblematic of a widespread sentiment. A frequent visitor to the United States, who typically traveled across the Atlantic twice a year, she told reporters she had canceled her planned Easter trip to visit family in Boston. The reason, she explained, was that the environment in the U.S. now felt hostile, scary, and profoundly unwelcoming. With an air of disbelief, she questioned why anyone would choose to spend their leisure time and money in a place that seemed so toxic. Her concerns were not merely about feelings. She pointed to the practical fear of arbitrary detentions at immigration, noting that there were plenty of other friendly countries that would gladly welcome her tourist dollars. Henderson was far from alone. Her personal decision reflected a new official reality. In the wake of the parasites, comment, and a hardening of immigration enforcement, foreign governments began to act. Travel advisories, once reserved for unstable or dangerous nations, started appearing for the United States. The British and German governments issued formal warnings, cautioning their nationals to be exceptionally vigilant with their travel documents due to a heightened risk of arrest. Most critically for Florida, Canada, the single largest source of foreign tourists to the state, issued its own advisories. The Canadian government warned its citizens about the risks of traveling to the U.S. after several European citizens were detained and, in some cases, deported by immigration officials for reasons that appeared unclear and arbitrary. When a government tells its people that a vacation to America could end in a jail cell, tourists listen. They cancel their flights. They book trips somewhere else. And in Florida, the businesses that depend on them begin to die. And while the parasites' comment alienated an entire continent, the problem was compounded by a more targeted and equally damaging series of political blunders that specifically targeted the single most important group of international visitors for Florida's economy, the Canadians. To understand the magnitude of this error, one must first grasp the unique and critical role that Canadian tourists, affectionately known as snowbirds, play in the state's financial ecosystem. They are not typical tourists. About 3.3 million Canadians visit Florida every year, but their impact is disproportionate to their numbers because of the duration and nature of their stays. They are the backbone of Florida's winter economy. Fleeing the harsh Canadian winters, they often stay for months at a time, renting condos, buying groceries, frequenting local restaurants, and shopping in local stores. They essentially keep entire communities afloat during the months when American families are tied up with school and work. When the snowbirds fail to arrive, businesses that have built their entire financial models around their presence face absolute and certain disaster. It was this indispensable group that Florida's own leadership chose to alienate. As if the federal government's hostile rhetoric wasn't enough, Governor Ron DeSantis added fuel to the fire with his own inflammatory comments in March of 2025. In a public statement, the governor articulated a policy view that was as honest as it was economically reckless. He declared, and it is worth quoting directly, that he wanted Canadian and Brazilian tourists subsidizing Florida's government so Florida residents could pay less in taxes. He went on to state explicitly that he had no intention of giving Canadians a tax cut. The message, stripped of any political niceties, was stark. Foreign visitors were not welcome guests, but walking wallets, viewed primarily as a revenue source to be exploited for the benefit of the state budget. Let that sink in for a second. The governor of a state whose economy is fundamentally dependent on tourism publicly framed his most loyal customers as a means to an end. The reaction was swift and furious. For Canadians who spend their hard earned money to support Florida's economy year after year, the comments were a slap in the face. They read the governor's quotes and ask themselves a simple, logical question: why should we spend our retirement savings to help pay for Florida's government when its leader treats us with such unconcealed contempt, valuing us only for the taxes we generate? Online forums and social media platforms, once filled with cheerful planning for Florida vacations, were now flooded with angry comments from former snowbirds. They declared they were done with Florida. They would take their money to Mexico, to Portugal, to the Caribbean islands, to places where the local government seemed to actually appreciate their business and welcome them as guests. A common sentiment emerged. Since the governor bragged about not needing them, they would let him discover firsthand this winter what happens when the snowbirds take their money and fly elsewhere. Governor DeSantis, for his part, attempted to downplay the concerns with a dismissive arrogance, insisting that he didn't believe Canadians would actually stop coming. Who would want to be in Canada during winter when they could be in Florida? He mused, certain that the allure of sunshine would override any feelings of being insulted or exploited. But the data tells a completely different, and for Florida, a much darker story. The numbers proved him disastrously wrong. Visit Lauderdale. The official tourism promotion agency for the Fort Lauderdale area reported a staggering drop of between 10 to 16% in Canadian visitors since April. The same region saw a 13.5% reduction in Canadians flying in. At Miami International Airport, a major gateway for international travel, arrivals were down about 1% through July. While that may sound small, it is a deeply alarming figure given that it came directly after 2024 had set an all-time record for air travelers in South Florida. When a record breaking year is immediately followed by a decline, it signals that something fundamental has shifted in the market. The snowbirds had heard the governor's message loud and clear, and they were responding not with words, but with their absence. It's important to understand that the crisis unfolding in Florida's empty hotels and restaurants is not an isolated phenomenon. It is the localized symptom of a much larger national malady. The hostile rhetoric and unwelcoming policies emanating from Washington, D.C., have triggered a nationwide collapse in international tourism, with Florida, due to its heavy reliance on foreign visitors sitting at the epicenter of the disaster. The projections from travel industry experts paint a grim picture for the entire country. The number of international visitors to the United States is predicted to plummet from 72.4 million in 2024 to just 67.9 million in 2025. That represents a net loss of 4.5 million people, 4.5 million individuals who would have spent money on hotels, meals, rental cars, souvenirs, and attractions. By August of 2025, the year over year decline was already stark, with international arrivals down 7%. Some analysts, tracking the data more closely, reported a decline as sharp as 14% compared to the same period in the previous year, calling it the most profound drop since the global shutdown during the pandemic. This decline in people translates directly into a staggering loss of revenue. Tourism, economics, a respected research firm that tracks travel trends, estimated that the U.S. tourism sector stood to lose approximately $64 billion in revenue in 2025 alone due to the combined drop in international and domestic travel. $64 billion. It is a number so large that it is difficult to comprehend, but it is not an abstract figure that gets quietly absorbed by a resilient economy. That is money that would have paid the salaries of hundreds of thousands of workers. It is revenue that would have kept family owned restaurants from closing their doors forever. It is income that would have supported families, paid mortgages, and covered medical bills. The loss of that $64 billion represents an economic catastrophe hiding in plain sight, an invisible tidal wave of financial hardship washing over communities across the nation. The reasons for this dramatic downturn go beyond the hurt feelings and national insults, though those certainly played a primary role. Prospective travelers now face a daunting array of real practical problems when attempting to visit the United States. Systemic barriers have been erected, intentionally or not, that make the process of visiting America more difficult, more expensive, and more intimidating than ever before. Visa processing times, for instance, remain painfully long in many countries, leaving people waiting for months for approval even after they have paid hefty fees and navigated complex paperwork. The strong US dollar, while beneficial in some economic contexts, makes everything in America more expensive for foreigners, turning meals and hotel rooms that seem reasonably priced to Americans into budget busting expenses for visitors from countries with weaker currencies. Perhaps most damaging of all is the widespread perception of an increasingly aggressive and arbitrary immigration enforcement system. Stories spread like wildfire through international social networks and media outlets about tourists, people with valid visas and legitimate travel plans being detained at the border, questioned for hours, and in some cases denied entry or summarily deported over minor paperwork issues that would have been overlooked in previous years. When travelers hear these accounts, they perform a simple risk versus reward calculation. They look at the high costs, the bureaucratic hurdles, and the looming anxiety of a potentially hostile encounter with an immigration officer, and they often decide the reward is not worth the risk. They choose other destinations that offer sun and beaches without the stress. Mexico welcomes them with open arms and affordable prices. Portugal offers beautiful coastlines and easy visa policies. The Caribbean islands advertise all inclusive packages that cost less than a Florida vacation and come with a guarantee of relaxation, not a gamble with border control. For every systemic barrier, the U.S. erects a dozen competing destinations offer a smoother, friendlier path. Now, amidst this clear and present crisis, one of the most bewildering aspects is the steadfast denial from officials who continue to point to visitor numbers as proof of success. The argument is often made that the situation cannot be as dire as business owners claim because the official statistics show that records are being broken. But this defense relies on a fundamental misunderstanding or a deliberate misrepresentation of what those official numbers actually count. The state's figures tabulate every single person who crosses into Florida, regardless of their purpose, their length of stay, or their economic impact. This includes truck drivers making deliveries, business travelers attending a single day conference, and families simply driving through the panhandle on their way to another state. These numbers completely fail to measure the metrics that actually matter to the businesses trying to make payroll. A visitor who stops for gas and a burger on Interstate 10 generates a trivial amount of economic impact compared to a Canadian snowbird who rents a condo for 3 months, eats at local restaurants every week, and shops at local grocery stores. By lumping these vastly different types of visitors together, the official statistics create a dangerously misleading illusion of prosperity. This is the great disconnect. It is why state officials can celebrate a headline number while small businesses are collapsing. They are measuring traffic, not commerce. They are counting bodies, not dollars. The reality on the ground, reflected in the balance sheets of struggling businesses, tells the true story. Profitability reports from tourism companies offer a much darker and more accurate picture. In April of 2025, the number of tourism companies reporting profitability had dropped to just 32%, a significant fall from 41% in April of the previous year. This means that more than 2 out of every 3 tourism businesses in the state are either losing money, barely breaking even, or are one bad month away from permanent closure. This situation is particularly dangerous because it feeds on itself, creating a vicious, self perpetuating cycle of decline. When tourists hear through news reports or see on social media that Florida's beaches are empty and its businesses are struggling, they begin to wonder what is wrong. The perception of a destination in decline makes them question whether visiting would be safe, enjoyable, or even responsible. This hesitation leads potential visitors to reconsider their plans, which in turn causes a further decline in tourism. This new decline then generates more negative news coverage and more viral videos, which frightens off even more potential visitors. Social media acts as a powerful amplifier in this cycle. A single video showing an empty boardwalk or a deserted restaurant can be shared thousands of times, convincing countless people that Florida is no longer the vibrant, fun destination it once was. The official narrative of success becomes irrelevant when a potential tourist's phone shows them a different reality. The state is no longer just fighting against negative rhetoric from its own leaders, it is fighting against a powerful and pervasive narrative of its own decline, a narrative that becomes more true with every tourist who decides to stay home. To truly grasp the scale of this crisis, you have to look beyond the empty hotel lobbies and quiet restaurants. You have to see the invisible economic web that connects every part of a community and how a break in one strand causes the entire structure to tremble. The collapse of tourism creates a devastating ripple effect that extends far into the local economy, touching lives and businesses that may seem far removed from the beachfront. Consider the charter boat captain who now spends his days maintaining an engine that rarely runs, his bookings down by more than half. His loss of income doesn't stop with him. It means he's no longer buying hundreds of dollars of bait and fuel from the local marina each week. It means the specialized mechanic he used to hire for engine repairs is also seeing a drop in business. The ripple continues outwards. Think of the local farmers and seafood suppliers. When restaurants are empty, their orders for fresh produce, fish, and meat are slashed. A restaurant that once ordered 500 pounds of shrimp a week might now only need 100. That's a catastrophic loss for the shrimper, for the distributor, and for the delivery driver. The commercial linen service that used to send trucks to a dozen bustling hotels every single day now has half its fleet sitting idle, its own workers facing reduced hours. The construction crews that were scheduled to begin renovating a hotel lobby find their contracts postponed indefinitely because the hotel owner can no longer afford the investment. Each canceled reservation is a shockwave that disrupts a dozen other livelihoods. This is how a community's economy slowly bleeds out. It also creates a social crisis. As 35,000 hospitality workers lose their jobs or have their hours cut, they can no longer afford rent, leading to a spike in evictions and putting immense pressure on local social services and food banks. The very tax revenue that funds these services, along with schools and road maintenance, also plummets. Tourist development taxes and sales taxes, which these communities rely on, evaporate when visitors stay home. This forces local governments to make impossible choices, cutting funding for essential services at the exact moment their residents need them most. What begins as an economic problem quickly metastasizes, eroding the social fabric of the community and replacing the vibrant energy of a tourist town with a quiet, creeping sense of dread. And it's critical to understand that the damage being inflicted extends far beyond immediate revenue loss and job cuts. It represents a long term erosion of brand America, a concept that for decades has been one of the nation's most valuable and powerful assets. For generations, the American brand symbolized opportunity, freedom, adventure, and fun. Tourists flocked to the United States because they wanted to experience the country they saw in movies, to taste the food they read about, to see the iconic landmarks, and to meet the friendly, open, and welcoming people they believed represented American culture. It was a brand built on a promise of excitement and possibility. In 2025, that brand is profoundly damaged, replaced in the global consciousness by images of aggressive immigration enforcement, hostile rhetoric toward foreigners, destabilizing trade wars, and a level of political chaos that makes international travelers deeply nervous. The allure is fading, replaced by anxiety. This brand degradation poses a significant threat to the nation's economic future, particularly concerning major international events scheduled to be held on American soil. The 2025 Ryder Cup, the 2026 FIFA World Cup, and the 2028 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles are all massive undertakings that rely heavily on robust international attendance. The U.S. Travel Association has already warned that these events could suffer from depressed attendance as tightened immigration policies and unwelcoming rhetoric make foreign visitors reluctant to come. The prospect of hosting the world's premier sporting events in half empty stadiums is not only a national embarrassment, but also represents a loss of billions of dollars in expected revenue. Airlines are already feeling the early effects of this trend. United Airlines has reported a significant drop in travel from Canada to the United States, along with declining demand for domestic travel. When airlines are forced to cut routes and reduce schedules due to falling demand, it makes travel harder and more expensive for everyone, creating yet another barrier that pushes potential visitors toward more accessible destinations. In the face of this multifaceted crisis, The proposed solutions have been largely superficial and inadequate, failing to address the root cause of the problem. In July of 2025, Senator Rick Scott introduced the Canadian Snowbirds Act, a bipartisan bill designed to allow retired Canadian citizens to stay in the United States for an additional 2 months each year, extending their visits beyond current visa limits. Senator Scott argued correctly that extending these stays would drive more investment into Florida's economy and support local jobs. However, such legislative fixes, while well intentioned, take a long time to pass and fundamentally miss the point. A bill allowing Canadians to stay longer is utterly meaningless if they no longer wish to come in the first place. The deeper problem is not about policy details or visa rules. It is about sentiment, respect, and the fundamental question of whether the United States is still a country that welcomes the world. Until the core issue of hostile rhetoric and an unwelcoming atmosphere is addressed at the highest levels of government, no amount of tinkering with visa lengths will bring the tourists back. The wound is emotional and psychological, and it cannot be healed with a legislative bandage. Ultimately, when you look at all the pieces, the tourism collapse devastating Florida and echoing across the nation is best described as a self inflicted injury. This is not a downturn caused by unavoidable circumstances like a natural disaster, a global pandemic, or an organic economic recession. This is a crisis created by choices, by the words spoken by politicians, and the policies enacted by their governments. When tourists stay away because they feel insulted, scared, or unwelcome, it is a wound that America has inflicted upon itself. One Florida business owner, watching her lifelong dream crumble as customers disappeared, captured the feeling of helpless anger perfectly. She felt betrayed, watching her livelihood evaporate because of decisions made in Washington that she had no power to influence or control. This is the tragic reality for thousands of business owners. They are the collateral damage in a political culture where divisive rhetoric is prioritized over economic reality, and where ego matters more than the people who depend on a functioning economy. The question that now haunts Florida is whether this represents a temporary, albeit painful setback, or a permanent structural change. Perhaps the winter will bring back just enough snowbirds to save the season from total disaster. Perhaps the diplomatic tensions with Canada and Europe will ease, and tourists over time will forgive and forget the insults. Maybe immigration policies will soften and visa processing will speed up. Or perhaps this is the new normal, a future where Florida's international tourism remains permanently depressed, a future where businesses are forced to adjust to chronically lower revenues by cutting more jobs and reducing services, a future where Florida loses its coveted position as America's premier vacation destination, eclipsed by competitors in Mexico, the Caribbean, and beyond, who have learned that welcoming visitors is better for business than insulting them. For the communities that built their entire existence around the promise of tourism, this collapse feels like the end of a way of life. In small coastal towns where grandparents ran hotels that their children expanded and their grandchildren expected to inherit, families now face the terrifying possibility of losing everything that was built over generations. When the economic engine of a community stops running, the entire fabric of life begins to fray. Schools lose funding as property values drop and tax revenues decline. Local services are cut. Hope gives way to despair. Across the state, Florida's business owners watch and wait. They hope for a change that may not come. They prepare for a winter that could break them if the snowbirds do not return in force. And they wonder, with each passing day, how much longer they can hold on before they are forced to give up. The crisis is not on the horizon, it is here right now. It is not a sudden dramatic crash, but a slow, agonizing bleed of customers, revenue, jobs, and hope, destroying lives and dreams while politicians celebrate numbers that bear no resemblance to reality. Florida built an empire on sunshine and the promise of fun. In 2025, that empire faces its greatest test, and nobody knows if the damage already done goes too deep to ever truly repair.